Before we begin tonight's episode, we want to take a moment to acknowledge the seriousness of the topic we're discussing. The ongoing conflict involving the United States, Israel, and Iran is not just political. It is real. It is unfolding in real time, and it is impacting lives across multiple countries. There are soldiers deployed, civilians caught in the middle, and families on all sides dealing with the consequences of decisions being made at the highest levels of power. The purpose of this conversation is not to sensationalize war or reduce it to talking points, but to explore the complexity of what's happening and the implications it may have globally. As always, the opinions expressed on Data and Dissonance are those of the individual panelists and are meant to reflect a range of perspectives. This discussion may include strong viewpoints, disagreement, and difficult realities. We encourage listeners to approach the conversation thoughtfully, to seek out multiple sources of information, and to remember that behind every headline are real human beings affected by these events.
There are moments in history where things shift, not slowly, not quietly, but all at once. Over the past few weeks, we've watched what started as targeted strikes turn into something much bigger. The United States and Israel have launched coordinated attacks on Iranian military targets. Iran has responded with missile and drone strikes across the region, not just against Israel, but into neighboring countries and areas where U.S. forces are stationed. We're now seeing critical infrastructure threatened, including areas near nuclear facilities. We're seeing American troops wounded and killed. We're seeing major disruptions in the Strait of Hormuz, one of the most important oil routes in the world, sending shockwaves through global markets. And maybe most importantly, we're seeing escalation. High-level Iranian leadership has been targeted and killed. Iran has vowed retaliation. The region is lighting up. So the question isn't just what's happening anymore. The real question is, where does this go next? Because history has shown us that conflicts like this don't always stay contained. Tonight we're asking the question, the Iran strike. Necessary defense or dangerous escalation? Let's bring in the crew. Brian is here, and I already know where he's leaning on this one. Brian sees strength, deterrence, and decisive action as the only language regimes like Iran understand, and he's going to argue that backing down now would be far more dangerous than pushing forward. Rachel is with us, bringing a more measured perspective, looking at the long-term consequences, the risk of escalation, and what happens when a regional conflict starts pulling in global powers. Daniel is here, and you know he's not just looking at the missiles in the headlines. He's looking at the bigger chessboard, alliances, strategy, and the deeper power dynamics that most people don't see. And Skylar is joining us, bringing the human side of this conversation, questioning the cost of war, the civilian impact, and whether military escalation is ever truly the right answer. Let's not dance around it. This is escalating fast. We've got U.S. airstrikes hitting Iranian missile infrastructure. We've got Iran launching retaliatory strikes across multiple countries. We've got global energy markets reacting, and we've got casualties already stacking up on multiple sides. And the argument being made by supporters of these strikes is simple. You either deal with the threat now, or you deal with it later when it's worse. So Brian, let's start with you. Was this the right move? Are these strikes necessary to stop a bigger threat? Or are we stepping into something that could spiral way beyond control?
Look, I'm going to be very clear about this, because I think people are dancing around the reality of what we're dealing with. Iran is not some neutral actor that just got dragged into a conflict out of nowhere. This is a regime that has spent decades funding proxy groups, destabilizing the region, and openly calling for the destruction of its enemies. They've been playing a long game, building influence through militias, weapons programs, and alliances that stretch across the Middle East. So when people act shocked that things have escalated, I think they're ignoring the fact that this has been building for years. The strikes we're seeing now didn't come out of thin air. They're the result of a long-standing conflict finally boiling over into direct confrontation. And here's the part that a lot of people don't want to say out loud. Deterrence only works if it's credible. If a country like Iran believes that it can push, provoke, and operate through proxies without ever facing direct consequences, then it has no reason to stop. At some point, there has to be a line where you say, enough. Targeting missile infrastructure, leadership networks, and military capabilities isn't about starting a war. It's about preventing a larger one, because the alternative is letting threats grow until they become much harder to deal with later. History has shown over and over again that weakness or hesitation in the face of aggressive regimes can lead to even bigger conflicts down the road. So from that perspective, I see these strikes not as reckless escalation, but as a necessary move to reestablish deterrence and send a message that there are consequences for continued aggression. Now, that doesn't mean there aren't risks. Of course there are. Anytime you're dealing with military action at this level, especially in a region as volatile as the Middle East, there's always the possibility that things spiral. But the idea that avoiding action somehow guarantees peace is just not realistic. Sometimes the choice isn't between war and peace. It's between confronting a threat now or allowing it to grow into something far more dangerous later. And from where I sit, allowing a regime like Iran to continue expanding its influence unchecked would be a much bigger long-term risk than taking decisive action now.
Brian's laying out the argument that a lot of people in this country, and frankly a lot of leadership circles, have believed for a long time, that deterrence only works if it's backed by action. And historically, there is some truth to that. There have been moments where failing to confront a growing threat early ended up costing far more later. But the flip side of that argument is where things get complicated, because once you move from proxy conflicts and tension into direct strikes on infrastructure and leadership, you're no longer operating in the shadows. You're out in the open, and that changes the stakes entirely. What we're seeing right now isn't just a show of force, it's a chain reaction. You hit their infrastructure, they respond. You escalate, they escalate. And suddenly what was meant to be a controlled demonstration of strength can start to take on a life of its own. We're already seeing retaliation across multiple areas. We're seeing disruptions in global trade routes, and we're seeing other countries watching very closely to decide where they stand. That's where the concern comes in, not just about whether the initial strike was justified, but about whether anyone truly has control over what happens next. Because once things reach this level, history shows us that conflicts don't always stay contained the way leaders expect them to. Rachel, let me bring you in here. You tend to look at the long-term consequences, not just the immediate decision, but what that decision sets into motion. Are these strikes a necessary step to prevent a bigger conflict? Or are we potentially opening the door to something much harder to contain?
I think what makes this situation so difficult is that both sides of this argument have elements of truth to them. And that's exactly why conflicts like this become so dangerous. Brian is right in the sense that Iran has been a destabilizing force in the region for a long time, and there are legitimate concerns about allowing that influence to expand unchecked. But at the same time, history also shows us that once direct military engagement begins between major powers or heavily armed states, the idea of controlled escalation becomes incredibly fragile. Every action creates a reaction, and those reactions don't always stay within the boundaries that leaders intend. What concerns me is not just the initial decision to strike, but the unpredictability of what follows. When you target infrastructure or leadership, you're not just sending a message. You're also increasing pressure on the opposing side to respond in a way that maintains their own credibility. From their perspective, not responding can look like weakness, just like Brian was talking about on our side. So now, you have both sides operating under the same logic of deterrence, which can quickly turn into a cycle where each move raises the stakes. And once that cycle starts, it becomes very difficult to step back without one side feeling like they've lost ground. The other layer here is that this isn't happening in isolation. There are regional alliances, global powers, economic consequences, and energy markets all tied into what's happening. The disruption in places like the Strait of Hormuz doesn't just affect the countries directly involved. It affects oil prices, global trade, and everyday people far removed from the conflict. So even if the original intent is to prevent a larger threat, the ripple effects can create instability in ways that are hard to predict or control. That's why I think the real question isn't just whether the strike was justified in the moment, but whether there is a clear strategy for what comes next. Because without that, escalation can take on a momentum of its own.
And that right there is where this whole thing starts to feel less like a single decision and more like the beginning of a chain reaction that nobody can fully control once it gets going. Because Rachel's point about both sides operating under the same logic is key. If deterrence is the strategy, then both sides believe they have to respond in order to maintain credibility. And when that happens, you don't just get one move. You get a sequence of moves, each one raising the stakes a little higher than the last. We've seen versions of this before. Conflicts that start with targeted strikes or limited objectives and then slowly expand because each side feels pressure not to back down. And the difference now is that the world is more connected than ever. What happens in one region doesn't stay there. It affects global markets, alliances, military positioning, and public opinion across multiple countries almost instantly. So while the original goal might be to prevent a larger threat, the reality is that once things escalate to this level, the margin for error becomes incredibly small. And that's where the conversation starts to move beyond just military decisions and into strategy, the bigger picture of who benefits, how power shifts, and what the long-term objectives really are. Daniel, let me bring you in here. You always look at the broader chessboard, not just what's happening, but why it's happening and who stands to gain or lose from it. Is this simply a direct response to Iranian actions? Or is there a larger geopolitical strategy playing out behind the scenes that most people aren't seeing?
I think if you only look at this through the lens of strike and response, you miss the larger framework that this is operating inside of. Because conflicts like this are rarely just about one event or one decision. They're about positioning. Iran isn't just a country in this equation. It's a regional power with influence that stretches through proxy networks, trade routes, and strategic geography. The Strait of Hormuz alone gives it leverage over a significant portion of the world's oil supply, which means any disruption there has global consequences almost immediately. So when you see strikes happening near that kind of infrastructure, you're not just looking at a military action. You're looking at a pressure point in the global economy being tested. Now zoom out even further, and you start to see how other major players fit into this. The United States isn't just responding to Iran in isolation, it's also signaling to allies and adversaries alike. Countries like Russia and China are watching very closely, not necessarily because they're directly involved, but because they're evaluating how the US responds to conflict, how alliances hold together, and how far escalation is allowed to go. Every move in a situation like this sends a message beyond the immediate battlefield. It's about credibility, influence, and the balance of power in a broader global system. And that's why these moments tend to carry more weight than people realize, because they can shift perceptions of strength or weakness on an international scale. At the same time, there's also a domestic layer to all of this that often gets overlooked. Governments don't make decisions in a vacuum. There are political pressures, economic considerations, and public opinion all influencing how leaders act. Military action can sometimes serve multiple purposes, addressing a perceived external threat, while also reinforcing internal narratives about strength and leadership. That doesn't automatically mean there's some hidden master plan controlling everything, but it does mean that these situations are rarely as simple as they appear on the surface. What we're seeing is a convergence of military strategy, economic leverage, and global signaling all happening at once. And when those forces intersect, the outcome isn't always predictable, because each player involved is making decisions based not just on the present moment, but on how they believe the future balance of power will unfold.
And that's what makes this situation feel so much bigger than just headlines about strikes and retaliation. Because when you start layering in everything Daniel just laid out, energy routes, global powers watching, internal political pressure, regional influence, it stops looking like a single conflict and starts looking like a pressure point in a much larger system. And historically, those pressure points are where things either get stabilized through strong leadership and clear strategy, or they spiral because too many variables are moving at once. Because here's the reality. While governments are making decisions based on strategy, positioning, and long-term influence, there are also real people caught in the middle of all of this. Civilians, families, communities, people who don't get a say in any of these decisions but end up living with the consequences of them. And that's something that can get lost when conversations become focused purely on military strength or geopolitical chess moves. Skylar, let me bring you in here. You tend to focus on that human side of these conflicts, the cost that doesn't always show up in strategic discussions or headlines. When you look at what's happening right now, do you see this as a necessary response to a real threat, or as another example of escalation where the human cost ends up outweighing the intended outcome?
When I look at this, I think it's really important to step outside of the strategic language for a moment because words like deterrence, escalation, and geopolitical positioning can make something incredibly human feel abstract. Behind every one of those terms are real people, families who didn't choose this, communities that suddenly find themselves living in fear, and individuals whose lives can change in an instant because of decisions made thousands of miles away. Civilian infrastructure gets damaged, supply chains break down, access to basic necessities becomes uncertain, and the psychological toll alone can last for years. That human impact doesn't always get the same level of attention as the military strategy, but it's one of the most important parts of the conversation. I also think it's worth questioning the assumption that military escalation is always the most effective path to long-term stability. There have been many moments in history where force was used with the intention of preventing a larger conflict, but instead created cycles of retaliation that lasted for years or even decades. When both sides feel justified in their actions, and both sides believe they need to respond to maintain credibility, it becomes very difficult to break that cycle. And in those situations, it's often civilians who carry the heaviest burden, while the broader objectives become harder to achieve. That doesn't mean there aren't real threats, or that security concerns should be ignored. Those are valid and serious. But I think the challenge is balancing those concerns with a recognition of the cost of escalation. The more this expands, the more likely it is that the consequences extend beyond the original scope of the conflict. And once that happens, it's not just a regional issue anymore. It becomes something that affects global stability, economies, and human lives on a much wider scale. So, from my perspective, the question isn't just whether the initial action was justified, but whether there's a clear path to de-escalation before the situation reaches a point where the damage outweighs whatever outcome was originally intended.
And that's the part of this conversation that really brings everything into focus, because you can look at this from the standpoint of strength, deterrence, and national security, like Brian laid out. You can look at it from the perspective of escalation risk and long-term consequences, like Rachel pointed out. You can zoom out to the geopolitical chessboard, like Daniel did. And then you come back to what Skylar just said, which is the human cost that sits underneath all of it. And the reality is, all of those things are true at the same time. That's what makes situations like this so complex and honestly so dangerous, because decisions that are made with one objective, whether it's deterrence, protection, or strategy, don't exist in isolation. They ripple outward. They affect economies, alliances, public perception, and most importantly, people who have no control over any of it. And once that ripple effect starts, it's incredibly difficult to contain. What we're watching right now isn't just a moment, it's a turning point. Maybe it stabilizes. Maybe leadership on all sides finds a way to step back and cool things down. Or maybe this becomes something bigger, something that pulls in more countries, more resources, and more consequences than anyone originally intended. And that's the uncertainty that sits at the center of all of this. So whether you see these strikes as necessary action or dangerous escalation, one thing is clear: this is not a story that's going away anytime soon. And it's one we're going to keep watching very closely.
Before we wrap up tonight's episode, we want to remind everyone that Data and Dissonance is more than just a podcast. It's a growing community built around conversation, perspective, and real discussion about the issues shaping our world. If you want to support the show, you can check out the official Data and Dissonance merch store, where you'll find everything from patriotic apparel and Gen X designs to mugs, hats, hoodies, bumper stickers, and more. And of course, one of our favorite parts of the lineup, the coffee. We've got 3 blends currently available, roasted right here in the United States from globally sourced beans. High Lakes is your light roast with bright citrus and milk chocolate notes, perfect for a smooth start to the day. Rock Creek is the medium roast with toffee, dark chocolate, and a hint of sweet orange, great for your everyday cup. And if you're someone who needs something bold to get through the morning headlines, Bitterroot is the dark French roast with a strong finish, cocoa notes, and that deep, rich flavor. All of it is available in whole bean or ground in 12-ounce bags, along with the rest of the Data and Dissonance gear, through the link in the show description. Now let's send it back to Artie for tonight's final thoughts.
There are moments when the world feels like it's moving faster than we can process it. Headlines stack up, updates come in by the hour, and before you've even had time to understand one development, something else happens that changes the entire picture. This is one of those moments. Because what's happening right now isn't just about one strike or one response. It's about how quickly things can escalate when multiple forces are in play at the same time. Military decisions, political pressure, economic consequences, global alliances, all of it moving together, all of it influencing what happens next. And the reality is none of us sitting here, not me, not the panel, not the people watching this unfold, truly know where it goes from here. What we do know is this. Moments like this test leadership, they test strategy, and they test whether the people making decisions understand the weight of what those decisions can become. Because history has shown us that once a conflict reaches a certain level, it becomes much harder to control than anyone expects. And yet at the same time, doing nothing in the face of real threats can carry its own risks. So we're left in that tension between action and restraint, between strength and consequence, between what feels necessary in the moment and what it may lead to down the road. And maybe the most important thing right now is to stay informed, stay thoughtful, and resist the urge to reduce something this complex into simple answers, because there aren't any. Thanks for being here with us tonight, and remember, speak truth, stir thought.
Tonight's episode of Data and Dissonance is brought to you by the expanding creative world behind the show, where the conversations you hear here don't just stop at the mic. They carry into stories and music built around the same themes of conflict, truth, and the realities shaping our world. If you've been following along with the deeper geopolitical conversations we've been having, especially episodes like tonight, then the Caleb Rourke thriller series is right in your lane. It starts with the Covenant Protocol, where a former operative is pulled into a global conspiracy that feels closer to reality than fiction. From there, the story intensifies in the Prophet Directive, where the lines between intelligence, power, and manipulation begin to blur even further. And now with Black Echo Rising, the stakes reach another level entirely, diving into modern warfare where information, influence, and covert operations can shape the outcome of global conflict just as much as boots on the ground. These aren't just action thrillers, they're stories built around the same kind of questions we ask on this show. Who's really in control? What's happening behind the scenes, and how far-reaching the consequences of power can be? But the creative side of Data and Dissonance doesn't stop with books. It also lives in the music. If you're looking for something real, something with weight behind it, you can check out the albums Uncaged and Four Wheelers and Hallelujah, both available now on Spotify and all major streaming platforms. Uncaged leans into a raw, grunge-inspired sound, influenced by bands like Pearl Jam and Alice in Chains, and pulls from real-life experiences, including struggles with addiction, the weight of war, and the battles that don't always end when you come home. It's honest, it's heavy, and it's personal. On the other side, Four Wheelers and Hallelujah brings that country backbone. Songs about faith, family, freedom, and the everyday people who keep this country moving. It's a different sound, but the same foundation: real stories, real experiences, and a message that sticks with you. You can find the Caleb Rourke thriller series on Amazon, and you can stream both albums on Spotify right now, because at the end of the day, Data and Dissonance isn't just a podcast, it's Retaliatory. It's a voice across multiple platforms, all built around one idea: telling stories that make you think and conversations that make you question.